All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CRX and Kansas webinar series on researching the far right, method, and ethics. So my name is Ulrike Gagnon, and I am an assistant professor at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa, based in Canada. I am also affiliated with the Center for Research on Extremism, based at the University of Oslo, and I am a member of the Executive Committee of CANSES, so the Canadian Network for Research on Security, Extremism, and Society. So for those who don't know the webinar series, it aims to facilitate a discussion on the ethical, methodological, political, personal, practical, and professional challenges involved in researching violent extremism and terrorism. So these webinars are offered on the third Thursdays of every month. So this is the first webinar of the new year, and we're really happy to host Dr. Ashley Matisse. So Ashley is a lecturer in digital media and culture at the University of Manchester. Her research interest includes digital extremist cultures propaganda material, so including that of the manosphere, the far right, the Tridewives, and QAnon. She's also interested in gender, communicative approaches, and economy of digital media circulation. Her expertise lies at the intersection of critical media study, visual rhetorical criticism, and digital cultural analysis through the lens of feminist STS and Black feminist theories. In today's talk, Ashley will explore the ethics of approaching the digital as a field site in online extremist research, including the implication both for the researcher and the research subject. So Ashley will present during about 20-25 minutes, and then this will be followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any question, please feel free to write them down using the Q&A button. So that's it for me. I will now give the mic to Ashley. So whenever you're ready, Ashley.
Let's unmute myself. Hello, everyone. It's not Zoom without someone talking while they're on mute, is it? All right. Let me share my presentation and get myself a little bit more organized. So I am really excited to be here with you all today to talk about the digital as field site. And thank you so much, Audrey, for planning all this and getting me into this series. It's a super exciting program. And this talk is based on a chapter that I wrote on this sort of general topic. And it's rooted in my experience researching the gendered logics of digital cultures of extremism and sort of how they promote racial hatred and violence. But the discussion is a bit wider, looking more broadly at sort of research ethics and folding in aspects of online extremism research. And I always feel maybe a little nervous talking or taking this sort of approach with extremism researchers and students. So if I don't quite hit the mark for you, like if you want more information about my research in extremism explicitly, let's take that up in the discussion in the Q&A, and I'm happy to sort of provide that for you. I've broken the topic into sort of three main sections. So the first section I'm going to discuss is going through the digital as field site and what I mean by that and what that looks like. And then I'm going to talk about more broadly negotiating ethics and in a general sense, but also give like a little example of how that works in my research. And then in the third section, the briefest section, I'm going to wrap up a little bit, talking about our unique position in the field, like how what we do is unique in this frame and how we can contribute to improving ethics in this context. So let's advance my slide and come back. So I wanted to start with a sort of research ethics positionality framework here. So this is what my training is and what I research. So I am a humanist. I'm in the humanities, which is a little unusual for this part of the field, although there are more of us every day. And I work on propaganda, visual materials, digital cultures, digital practices, a variety of things. And I do this through this sort of critical cultural lens in these three areas. And these things all shape my sort of relationship to ethics, my relationship to what research ethics should look like, what research with extremism should look like. And along with this, I'm a US scholar. I work in the UK, but I'm a US scholar trained there and with the experiences of dealing with ethics and review and all of those things in the US context. So that also shapes my relationship to ethical concerns and questions. And our geographies are sort of our culture, from our disciplines and things will shape the answers to these questions for us in some ways. So it's good to be able to sort of think about what the shaping factors are for you as well. All right, let's advance to the next slide. Now, hey, I've lost my notes. There we go. Okay, so on to my sort of main argument. So my main argument is that digital contexts are more like field sites than anything else in research. And to sort of frame that up, I'm going to share a quote from the Sage Guide to Qualitative Research. And that is, quote, simply stated, field research is the systematic study of ordinary activities in the settings in which they occur. Its primary goal is to understand these activities and what they mean to those who engage in them. To gain this understanding, field researchers collect data by interacting with, listening to, and observing people during the course of their daily lives, usually in some self-contained setting, such as an elementary school classroom, a street corner, a car dealership, or a public housing community, end quote. So we're going to come back to this in a little bit, but hang on to that conceptually as I go through the features of the digital and think about how that they relate to this concepts of exploration. Okay, so first sort of issue that we come up against is that scholars often, and even ethical review committees and boards often, tend to think of the digital as a data source. If people aren't doing direct work with human interlocutors, that is surveys, focus groups, interviews, particular types of digital ethnography, because there are digital ethnographies that are observation only, right? People think of this as a data source. And this is problematic for a variety of reasons, but it is also magnified because of trends toward big data collection, big data analysis that are brought about by the vast scope of the digital, of the internet, of social media, right? There's so much data and it's so big. How do we actually look at this? And the movement to sort of quantitative, qualitative research and mixed methods research foregrounds this. Many more early career scholars are doing more with computational analysis along with other forms of qualitative analysis, which is great. But this push toward computation and big data helps us fall into this idea that the internet is data, not people. And that's a problem because it's a socio-technical system. The data is always tied to people, right? It's always people doing things, practices, engagement. So how do we navigate that? And this is a version of what we call in internet studies datafication. So the image on the screen is actually from like a social media marketing frame, but this idea also pushes us. There's so many features in the platforms, there's so many features available that collect numerical statistical data for us that it makes it easy to see this as a data source and not a people source or a field site. All right. The other sort of question that tends to arise is, hey, but I just do textual research, right? This is also a problem. And I say that even though that's exactly what I do. I do textual research, essentially. I don't work with people. But text on the internet and social media are not like traditional printed text or art or even music. In these contexts, texts are always tied to people. These are socio-technical systems where the mediation, right, the media is participatory and highly affectively charged, often utilizing sarcasm, irony, or trolling. You can't always trust, they're not reliable texts for sure. And these texts are not static. They're dynamic and changeable as various users and user communities take them up and interact with them. Examining digital texts is not the same as going to a library or an archive. This has quite a few implications for research. First, it situates online text within the field of user practice, which would be fieldwork. It also means that when we bring together a variety of online sources across platforms, we are imposing structure on the data, which we must then be transparent about. And it's not what users would naturally see or experience, right? We're shaping how knowledge is produced about a thing that we're creating, in essence. So along with this, the participatory mediation in digital context creates cultural palimpsests, where layers of meaning may have been embedded or accreted to a particular object or practice, and which may be specific to the digital cultural context. And we regularly see this in online extremism and terrorism content that blend ideological and popular cultural components to produce an intended meaning, right? So this shapes what we're doing with the text. It's never one text, right? So even when we are not specifically conducting human subjects research or participant research, we are researching people's engagements, interactions, and digital practices, right? And this means it is more like field work in a field site. So when we shift our view to the digital as field site and digital research as field research, it generates more ethical quandaries and demands more from us in terms of negotiating our research design and practice. And we can think about sort of similarities with other field sites, right? So they are social spaces, they're relational, where we're studying interaction between individuals and groups. They're cultural and community, where norms are established. They're observable, right? But we can also think about how they're different, and that's sort of where our conundrums come in. They're vast in scope compared to an in-place field site. The cultures and communities are overlapping and intermingled, right? Tradwives hang out with far-right extremist women, right? People may move between more than one community or culture, and they may do that simultaneously. Users might have multiple identities. Metadata, interactional data, affective data are connected to these. It is unbounded in comparison to in-place field sites. And online social norms versus in-person social norms, right? They're different, and there's different temporalities. So like I would argue that you have community on Reddit, even though I may respond to a post that's 3 years old, because it's asynchronous. It's not a synchronous conversation. So we have to take those things into account. And along with this, we have to consider a sort of unique situation. So that not just the features and affordances of the digital generate the characteristics, but there is the issue of platform governance, right? How the platforms control the sites. Then there's the issue of policy and regulation, and that is constantly shifting. So is platform governance. And then we also have the issue of, losing the plot there a little bit, political pressure. So we can see this with the really recent case, the ongoing case right now of Grok and the Nudify features of Grok AI and how people are reacting to that in real time. It's actually very fast, even for the internet, how that's playing out. But you can see all the tensions around this, right? And so we have to like do this work and do these ethics in this context that is regularly shifting, which means we have to think about it quite often. And the digital context is slightly different because it shifts power balances between researcher and researched people. So on the one hand, research subjects online deserve the same sort of ethical considerations, things like informed consent. And there's a literature around this, a debate around this, where even websites we consider public, like Twitter, users on those sites think that they should be able to approve or disapprove research, right? So there's tension here. But we also have issues where researchers themselves are harmed, both through online harassment, which disproportionately affects marginalized scholars, women, LGBTQ scholars, Muslim and Jewish scholars, Black, Indigenous, and people of color scholars. Even early career scholars tend to be harassed more because they have less institutional support. And we also have the issue of secondary trauma. More and more frequently, we're talking now about the trauma or bystander type trauma that researchers can experience looking at violent and dangerous and hateful content. So that's different from an in-place field site, and we need to address that. So this leads us to section 2. What do we do? What do we do with all of that, right? That's a lot of things to think about. So how do we approach it? Right now, best practices and standard norms for negotiating digital research ethics generally are still being worked out, and they're definitely still being worked out in extremism and terrorism studies. Although I think we might be a little bit further ahead in some of these questions, at least some of the time. The standards and practices of offline research are of course useful, right? But they don't map directly onto the digital context. Some guidance has been broadly developed for internet research. In specific, the Association of Internet Researchers has a guide. I'll talk about it a few times throughout this. That's very useful, and many people, including the UKRI, the British funding body, points back to that guide. And then we also have guidance that's been written more recently for extremism and terrorism research, particularly the threats framework from John Morrison, Andrew Silk, and Ekabant, that looks at this. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. So as we're sort of thinking about this and asking questions, what issues do we need to attend to? The sort of regular issues that come up around digital research and extremism research as well online are questions of what is public and what is private. We tend to do compliance-based public work, right? So Twitter, right? You see lots of studies on certain platforms because those are the easiest to get compliance for. that doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually public, because the people that are populating them don't think they should be public for research necessarily. We have scope and scale, that issue of the vastness and all the data. We have issues around reproducible studies. Most people don't have the time, the years and years and years to do a multi-platform study of a thing. People tend to do one platform, or they tend to do an easy compliance platform. We don't have apples to apples comparisons, and we don't have studies that look at this in a holistic way, right? We have lots of little studies, but we don't have this overarching sort of framework, because the internet is so broad and social media are so broad. So we also have issues around ethical review and compliance, and whether your ethics review committee understands what you're doing, both in internet research and in extremism research. In some cases, like for me, because I do textual research, I don't get ethical review. I have to ask for ethical review, and often they say no. So that can be a problem. Regular issues that are especially salient for us as extremism and terrorism researchers are issues around informed consent and who we're going to consent. Issues around citation of online sources. I've had a couple papers that have cited me as a source because I cited an original primary text, and they didn't want to point people to that text. I'm like, well, there's a problem there, right? That's a problematic frame of citation, but it needs to be debated. We need to discuss how that's going to happen. Publicizing or platforming potentially hate, violence, or extremism, right? There's a big debate in the field about whether or not certain modes like interviews, certain modes like participant research, potentially platform extremists. So there's debates and discussions there. We also have the issue of researcher safety online and trauma. Okay, let's go. Next slide. So how do we start to think about all of this? There are three sort of primary layers or aspects to consider ethically. First is compliance. That's the base layer. Next is what I would call scholarship, and the third is commitments. So compliance are the legal, regulatory, and institutional requirements, the minimum that needs to be done to get ethical approval, right? Assuming that you're required to get ethical approval. Scholarship sort of covers the norms and expectations of your disciplinary area, right? There's going to be disciplinary specific things that are normal for you. And then commitments covers your ethical stances. So those may be methodologically driven, they may be personal commitments. There's a variety of things that could happen there. But these three things can sometimes be in tension, and they all sort of have to be addressed in some way for you to be doing ethical work. Now, one of the things about not getting ethical review, even though it's administratively or bureaucratically easier, it's not necessarily easier ethically, because you don't have oversight of what you're doing. So for people that are in that boat like I am, often we have to work with other scholars and engage with other scholars to get a sense of, hey, is what I'm doing, does that sound right to you? Does that sound reasonable and ethical to you? So you may have to extend into community networks to do some of this at the present time. Another facet that has to be negotiated in this is institutional versus individual tensions. And this comes up a lot around, or I write about it, around researcher safety online and institutional responsibility. But sometimes what the institution is driving toward and what you think is ethical are very different things. And the institution will foreclose research based on sort of concerns around legalities. I know once APIs, application programming interfaces to pull data from social media companies, once those were sort of shut down or went into fee structures, a lot of universities will now say you have to follow the policy of the company in order to pull your data, which limits data collection. So like things like that are a thing that are in big tension. And at the same time, they're pushing off a lot of this responsibility, especially if we're not getting ethical review, onto us, while expecting us to be highly visible and to sort of portray the research excellence of the university. So it's a thing that you do have to navigate and can impact your work. So how did I sort of deal with this as a grad student moving into a postdoc and then into my lecturing position? I really sort of pushed into thinking about how and why I was doing what I was doing, and what that means and where I was located. And that the framework for that is called reflexive research design. This also comes from sort of my training around methods and methodology, which I'll get into in a minute when I go into the example. But reflexive research design is a way of sort of thinking about the positionality of the researcher and your research choices and how those inflect the research. What is more common in our field and in internet research broadly is what I would call reflective research design or question-based research design, because our projects are all different. So you see this in the AOIR Internet Research Guide, and you see this in the FRETS framework. They're question-driven. They're very good. They're meant to help you figure out your ethics for yourself, but also to take to a review board for review boards to use to understand both internet and extremist research in a way, because they're not trained specialists in it typically either. But so finding a stance for how you design your research that aligns with what you're doing and that can allow you to be adaptable, so whether it's reflective or reflexive or both, is a useful way of navigating all of this quandary, because it allows you to adapt as you go and as things change in the context. So putting this into practice, what does this look like? I'm actually gonna do that so you guys can read it. Okay, so basically I used a framework I derived from a piece written by a woman, a scholar named Leslie McCall in 2005. And she was writing about intersectionality. So two of my methods I was trained in were decolonizing methodologies and intersectionality. And this piece we read during that class, and it helped me really think about what I was doing. And so she used the frame of paradigm, methodology, and method. So paradigm is something that shapes your inquiry, shapes everything on the way down. Methodology is, right, this sort of principles that you're going to use that inform your method and what your commitments are on a scholarly level. And then the method derives from that. And so, like I said, my methodological training was in decolonizing, methodology, and intersectionality, both of which foreground, right, equal justice, foreground collaboration with participants, foreground caring for communities we're researching in. And I got into that and hit a very large wall because I was researching the manosphere at the time. And these are people that call for extreme violence against people like me. And I went, whoa, I agree ideologically with all of these things. I agree with them. They are commitments that I think are really important. And yet I'm not going to consent this community. I'm not going to collaborate with them. I'm not going to do any of these things. So what do I do about that? And I had to really sort of think. And for me, it had to become that intersectionality and decolonizing methodologies were my paradigm. Intersectionality shapes how I formulate my inquiry. It shapes how I ask my questions. It shapes the analytic possibilities that are going to come later. Decolonizing shapes my practice and how I think about research design. But it isn't a direct one-to-one match with these communities. When I do other research, not extremism research, I can put it into practice a bit more. But then that led me to, okay, well, then what is my sort of methodological stance? Well, if I'm not going to consent the communities, if I'm not going to do that, then I'm not going to study users, because I believe that people who are using these systems should be consented. So I tend to study ideologues, influencers, people who are intentionally being public, people who are monetizing their public information, right? That's that public-private divide. And what that means then is that I don't necessarily need to consent them, right? It also means I focus on ideology, right, and propaganda, not uptake, right? So these are changes to my research that I try to be transparent about. And it means that methodologically I take a grounded approach. And I do that because then I have to be responsible to the content of the texts themselves, the content of the pieces I'm looking at, and what those people have literally said, and be able to point back to that at all times when I'm doing an analysis. And that helps me sort of navigate the difficulties of researching something that I disagree with and try to be fair to that content, while at the same time bringing to bear the rest of my knowledge and my analytical burden on that. Within that, then I have the methods that I'm trained in, which are visual analysis and a variety of things, but I do that way. And so with grounded frameworks, that means that I'm letting themes emerge from the texts, that I'm thinking, excuse me, about context, and that I'm doing an iterative process to make sure I'm being true to what's there, if that is of interest to you. And I find that to be really useful in extremism research. Along with this, I also do not do large data in pretty much any way, shape, or form. I do not do, excuse me, I need some water. I do all manual collection of my data that helps prevent me from seeing data from users that I won't analyze. Excuse me. And therefore, I can sort of keep my commitments. Online extremism and terrorism comprise a highly diverse and loosely organized field. We draw from across a wide array of disciplines, use all varieties of methods, and bridge academia, policy, practitioner, and industry arenas. We are used to dealing with ethical, methodological, and methods-based complexity, given the nature of our topic of study. Moreover, we are used to working collaboratively across contexts in a transdisciplinary manner. So we are uniquely positioned not just to begin to lead the way in developing and testing best practices with relation to digital ethics, methodologies, and methods, but also with researcher safety online. And case in point, our field is already at the forefront of this work. Initial calls, like my work, I've done quite a few pieces now on researcher safety online. Calls for attention to that over the last few years have now developed into a growing body of not just discussion in meetings where it started or publications, but also empirical studies seeking to find out what researchers are experiencing, what their best practices are, how they're learning about researcher safety and online ethics. And so we started this as a process. It needs to continue and it needs to get more robust, but we're doing a really good job of it. And what we've done here provides a roadmap for thinking more broadly about ethics and methods in the frame of online extremism and terrorism research, right? If you buy my argument that the digital is a field site, if you buy the arguments I've made, then online research is one thing, extremism and terrorism research is another thing, and then online extremism and terrorism research is its own sort of thing. We connected to the others, but we need our own framework. And so it's important to know that discussions of these topics exist. And as I said, I would talk about the guide. So on the left, you've got the cover image of the AOIR, the Internet Researchers Guide. And on the right, you've got the paper around FRETS that explains how the framework for research ethics and terrorism studies works. These are the two big ones right now. There are other sort of smaller guides. There might be disciplinary guides as well to refer to, but most point back to the AOIR guide for internet research. We do need to bridge these two formats, right? FRETS does not deal with online research at all. So where do we find our place? And it's difficult because we're not a unified discipline. But we can get there. Excuse me again. I do not know what is going on with me today. So what we really need at this point is to be talking about this more publicly, to be publishing. What are you doing? Write a paper about your ethics, write a paper about your ethical choices, include a section in your papers about this so that other people can learn from you, so that we can have a debate. And we need to be teaching about this, not just our doctoral students and our postgraduate taught or MA students, but also our undergraduate students. A lot of them are wanting to work on projects around this because it impacts their lives. I know on research teams I've helped lead, we've had multiple students and student groups come to us with very specific projects they wanted to do because it was stuff they were seeing in their lives. In particular, QAnon was one. Students were coming because their parents had gotten sucked into QAnon and things like that. So they need to understand this as well because they're in it in their everyday lives. But more than that, they're also going to become practitioners and analysts and people, even if they don't stay into higher ed and come into academia, we will be working with them again. And so helping them understand this early on is beneficial to our field overall. And on that note, I'm sorry. I'm going to say thank you, and I look forward to our discussion, and I can't wait for your questions.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That was such an interesting presentation. I've learned a lot, actually. I'm already a fan of your work, so I'm not disappointed by the presentation at all. I think that we should talk more often about ethics and about the way we do things, and also about just the question we have. Like, we all face different dilemma, and talking about it is so important because we're a community in the end, right? We don't have to do this alone, and it just improves, like, makes best practices when we talk to one another. So thank you so much. We have about 25-30 minutes for the Q&A. If you have any question, just write them down. Oh, I see that there's no Q&A section actually.
There's
So
a
there
mic.
is there one? There's a
I
chat.
see it on
Oh
I
yeah,
see it
there's
on
a
my
Q&A. Oh, okay. My screen is too. I'm working on a smaller screen today, so some of the button disappeared. So we have a few questions already, but if you have any question, please feel free to just write them down using the Q&A button. If it doesn't appear on your screen, it might be the same as mine. So you have to click on the More button, and then you will see the Q&A button appear. Okay. So we have a first question from Leon saying, well, this is perfect for me as a PhD candidate and a BE/MA supervisor, so thank you. Do you find that in this socio-political climate on both sides of the Atlantic, ethical approval for critical research on the extreme right is more difficult? And do you have any cheat codes that helps with the approval?
Um, Hi, Leon. And I'm glad this is useful for you. Um, as I said, I no one requires me to do ethical review for the work I do because I don't interact with people technically, right? Which is bananas. I mean, like I knew a guy over here that was researching manifestos. He read manifestos all day long. Like it's crazy to not review that. Like he might need support, right?
Yeah.
But I can imagine from the friends I've got back at home and the people I was working with, certainly in the US, things have gotten very tendentious. And people are, I would imagine it's quite a bit more difficult to get ethical approval for most things right now, but especially things that potentially are on the far right, because our politics, like the far right, has become the right in some ways. So in the U.S., over here, I haven't tried yet. So that might be better addressed to one of the other network members that does need ethical review more often in the UK. I've only been in the UK. I'm in partway into my second year, so bear with.
Okay, second question here. Again, thank you so much for your talk. This is so helpful. Can you elaborate why you cannot get ethical clearance because of working with text only? Yeah.
Yeah, so the US, not we don't have a national standard, so it depends on where you're located. But I was at a very large, what we call Research One University, a very high research output doctoral granting university. And yeah, if you didn't do human subjects research, they didn't consider it research that needed review, and they would literally send you an email that says this isn't research. Thanks. Like that was my whole department basically, right? So yeah, it was because it wasn't interacting with human. Like this is where that compliance thing comes in. Institutional review boards were university wide at that school, and so they had so much research that they had to review. They weren't going to spend time reviewing research they didn't legally have to review, and so there's no legal requirement. Like it's not viewed as a harm to look at text, what is considered text. So they didn't, if that makes sense.
We have the same thing here in Canada as well. Like if you're researching, especially if it's public platforms like
Yeah,
public Facebook pages, Twitter,
exactly.
anything, YouTube, then it's considered as public data. It's just like analyzing a newspaper article, for instance. So they
Exactly.
don't consider that you need ethical clearance for this, even though it's an extremist page or even though they promote propaganda, violent material.
But this is one of those problems with not considering researcher safety, right? This is why we've been advocating, one of the reasons we've been advocating now for almost 8 years. So part of that's online harassment, but part of it is also like the secondary trauma, right? Or the problems you can have from interacting with really highly persuasive, dangerous materials, right?
Yeah. Okay, we have a few more questions. So I'm gonna go jump to the next one. Okay, once again, thank you very much for your interesting work. So it's a question from Andrea. I actually have a specific case study question. So I work on online hate speech and conduct ethnographic observation on TikTok. As a researcher, I always struggle with the fact that I have to rely on comments remaining visible, for example, but as a citizen, I would like to report them. However, that would be actively interfering in the discourse. How should this be handled? Just report it anyway? Like, what would be your advice?
I mean, this is actually a debate. There is no solid response to this. Some people don't report it till after they're done with their research because they need it there for their research. Some people feel very strongly that you should report it right away. Um, I think I think there are sort of frameworks that you can use to not disrupt your research and report things. I don't think it depends on how long the study is ongoing, right? So it may be that for you, waiting to do that until after you're done with your research so you're not impacting and interrupting the research might be the better answer. For other people, like once I've pulled down my data, I don't like I take everything I can off the web and off social media so that it doesn't get removed later, right? Internet Archive is also my best friend. But like I don't observe the same site for a really long time. So I can report things right away if I choose to. I haven't done it because most of what I look at is not the hardcore extremism. Like most of what I look at is propaganda for recruitment. And so they wouldn't take it down, if that makes sense. Like every time I've ever tried to do that, they're like, no, we won't take this down. And I'm like, okay, thanks. So you might even find that you go to report it and they're just like, no, we won't take it down. So it might be worth talking to the rest of your research. I don't know if you're researching alone or the rest of your research team, and working out what you all think together might be a reasonable framework for helping in that capacity in terms of um, reporting what you're seeing, right? Um, Alternately, it might be like, okay, I don't do it on this platform, but I do it everywhere else where I'm not researching, right? Like that may be the way you deal with it. So like because it's your research, you can't interact with it, but then you're like, okay, that means that I'm definitely every time I see something that's reportable on any other site I interact on, I'm gonna report that because I can at least clean that up. I don't know if that would help affectively, like help your emotional state. But it is a tricky question and it's not a settled question.
Mm. Okay, we have a question now on the researcher well-being. So, any advice for dealing with overwhelm when working through online sources or data? So, with all available on extremist websites, podcasts, video blogs, etc., I find myself experiencing paralysis when I try to delve into all of it. So, this is why interviews sometimes feels easier, but getting willing interviews is getting harder and harder. So, how do you deal with that?
Okay, so first you've named like a bunch of different types of content, and you don't have to do all of them all at once, right? So, like, if you want to focus on one, focus on websites, focus on podcasts. Like, there's plenty of scope to do that. It means you'll clearly have a very long trajectory of things to look at. And I would focus on the ones that seem most productive for the questions you want to answer. I come from an inquiry driven framework. So, like, it depends on what your question is, right? When I was working on Manosphere stuff, that was almost all websites. So a lot of my work focused on websites, and their YouTube channels were really bad. That's changed in the meantime. So now you could look differently, but that concatenated it for me. If you might change it because like I'm a visual scholar, so I need often these days I look at sites that have imagery specifically or have video specifically. But that would be another way to sort of concatenate it. I also look at influencers, so that helps limit what I'm looking at. But the biggest thing that I found, especially when I was started doing this as a grad student, is you can't work on this at the same pace, or at least I couldn't, that you do other sort of research projects. I got to a point where I'm like, and this is still my rule, no more than 3 days working in a row on looking at content. No more. And then I take at least one, but probably as many days, 3 days off to be normal in the world before I go back. And so that makes my projects take longer and I have to account for that. But basically what was happening is I started to get this sense that like I was researching the manosphere, I saw flyers for some of these groups on the campus, and I was sort of down the rabbit hole with the stuff I didn't agree with, but it felt omnipresent in my life. And I started to feel like everyone around me, like particularly because it's men, all the men around me, like I couldn't trust anyone. Like I started to get really twitchy. And then I was like, okay, I just can't be in this all the time. I have to like go look at cat and videos where cats and dogs get along. Like that is my favorite. Animals that aren't supposed to get along is my favorite internet video genre. But just like look at stuff that's good in the world and remember that there's stuff that's good in the world. And so managing your time effectively, limiting your access, there are ways, like if you're looking at really difficult content, there are ways that you can, depending on what your aim is. If you're not doing a visual analysis of the content, if you're like listening to it or transcribing it, you don't have to see the images big. You can make the window very small. You can make it black and white and gray it out as much as possible so you don't get the interference. There are strategies for coping with volume overwhelm, with trauma. Um, in order to sort of do this work better, I definitely would recommend the Reassure report and sort of the work at Fox Paul around. There's a lot of reports published and things up there where people have started to talk about what they do as a way to deal with the research. And I would talk to whoever like your supervisor is, or talk about like talk through someone with your specific project and about which one of those content or types of content make the most sense for the work you want to do. And then that way you can narrow into one piece and not try to do all of it at once.
I think this is such good advice. I think that you need a plan before doing this kind of research, just making sure that you respect your own limits as well and that you find a way that actually works for you.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
I didn't, and let me tell you, I didn't even not use my I was so young, like as a researcher when I started this. I used my own YouTube account to look up extremist content.
Uh-oh.
I did not have research accounts. No one knew, no one told me. So like for years, it was like, here's 80s pop music, here's extremism together in my YouTube channel. It took me years to get out of that. And every now and again, I still get a video that pops up. But yeah, you do like pre-planning is helpful. So the more thinking you can do before you embark on a project with someone who's done this work before, that tends to be a problem. Like my advisor knew about hate, but didn't know about the internet, which was why I used my own YouTube account. But like if you can talk to someone who's done this before, look for networks or websites, research groups that have connections for early career researchers and grad students. Because if you're not, like, I'm in people don't by and large generally study extremism in my discipline. So I was really isolated. It wasn't until I found that the terrorism and extremism researchers, I was like, cool, I can ask people these questions, right? And could engage more. So some of that exists, and the Voxpol networks ethics webpage has a bunch of resources that would probably be useful.
Like, I'm gonna move to another question. Moving to methodology now. So I'm gonna read it. I am a PhD student working on Iranian far right, doing anthropology slash history. I like using both methodology. I'm confused how to trace my choices in the field. It is very affectional, and also people are assuming that I'm also far right. So how should we prioritize reflective methodology while designing and doing field work?
Okay, so reflexive methodology actually comes from a fieldwork setting. It comes from like allied health and participant health settings. Um, so there's work, it won't be in history and anthropology, but there is work on how to do this in fieldwork. But one of the things that people like, so not unlike a fieldwork journal, people will keep a reflexive journal about their research choices. And part of what you do in that way is at the end of, like, you go out to do your research or you set up your questions, and you look at the question, you say, why am I asking these questions? Right? What is the value of these questions to the research? What in my experience is inflecting this, right? So you can do it at the question stage. You can do it post interview. So you got your notes, you're looking at them and you think, okay, like, how did I shape the conversation that's being had here? Or how did I shape the views that are in this frame? In terms of people assuming you're far right, that's a little bit of a different, I would need more context to understand where that's happening. Is it people you're talking to in interviews? Is it people in your department or in academia that think because you're doing this, you're far right? So I'm not quite sure how to answer that piece. But part of it is thinking about how if you're dealing with talking to other people, it's a question of thinking about how you're framing yourself, how you're stating your positionality, how you're talking to people. Like, you can write up a script of how you talk to people about this, including people in academia, right? To sort of, but you have to do sort of this thinking about, why do I do this? What do I do? Like, part of the reason I was looking at sort of, one of the reasons I started looking at women in the far right, I'd done the manosphere, then I thought, that's hate. I'm gonna pivot for my PhD. My PhD was not on extremism. My PhD was on how mothers use like digital context to articulate their political voice through their children, like maternalism. Except in the middle of doing this, I found a video of far right women saying we use maternalism to recruit, and I went, well, crap. I'm right back in it. Gonna go do that. And I have like a whole sideline. Like, my extremism research was my sideline research in my PhD. But like, it just sticks, like it sticks for me, right? So like, as I was sort of doing that, I had to sort of think a little bit about, like, well, why does this resonate for me, right? I'm a middle-aged white woman. I'm a scholar. I want to study race, but I don't want to capitalize on being a white woman who studies race. I have a problem with that. Like, and that's not a thing I can control. The university provides that privilege in some ways. I do want to sort of dismantle racism. So, like, studying whiteness was a choice rooted in all of those things. And so, when I talk to people about it, particularly people that are a little concerned about uh, potential far rightists in the academy, I explain all of that. Like, this is why I do this work. This is the orientation. This is the aim, right? But you have to think through what your commitments are and figure out what you can say that both explains that and doesn't make you feel uncomfortably vulnerable.
Hmm. And if I may add, because I see that the comment was about the people in the field assuming
Okay.
that they are far right. I know that Hilary Pilkington wrote a little bit about this. She called this the contagion of stigma. So this idea that because in the context of your research you are interacting with people
Yeah.
on the far right, then people around you are thinking, well, if they are able to talk to these people, maybe it's because they are not that far away from one another, ideologically speaking, which of course uh, is not true, right? But this is
Well, and
something, yeah.
Lizzie Pearson would also be a good person to talk to about this because she's done field work both with the British far right and British sort of jihadists, right?
Mm,
Um, and like interviews and stuff. So she like her work, but also you could probably email Lizzie. It would probably be okay. She's part of Voxpol, but she has dealt with both sort of issues around that with interview subjects, but also issues in the field.
mm.
So you're not the only one, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, you're not alone. Okay, we have another question. Have you used the Wayback Machine in your research, so to study deleted tweets, for instance? And if so, what ethical issues have you encountered while doing this?
So I tend to use Wayback Machine more for websites than for tweets. That would be like a lot of work. I have to figure out how to do that. Um, so when I was doing it for websites, I was looking at specific pages. I wanted to assess change in pages over time because I was looking at ideology and how that ideology was expressed. So, for example, um, the one of the primary manosphere sites I looked at in my master's work, like by the time I got to it, it was like, oh, gender was like the root of all evil, right? But I went back in time, and when it first started, it was not gender, it was capitalism. But capitalism did not sell as the root of all evil. Like anti-corporation stuff did not sell, and it changed over time. And part of the argument you can make there is like it's disingenuous, right? They're trying to get their ideology out. It's not like sure, gender's a thing, but like this hardcore like issue around this misogyny as an ideology didn't really mobilize until gender was the framing, right? Um, but yeah, tweets. I'm trying to imagine like what sort of ethical concerns would you have? So that's how I would position it. Is like, what are you worried about in doing that? Because is it that it's a deleted tweet now? Is it that like that's where I would start questioning like why does this concern me? What do I think is possibly unethical about it? And how can I address that concern? That's usually what I do when I don't know the answer to a question like that. Unless you're asking about a very specific compliance issue, in which case you would need to talk to your compliance officers because they'll be the ones who can tell you yes or no.
All right, we still have a few minutes left for any questions. So if anyone in the room have question for Ashley, this is your time.
Your chance.
Right, just waiting a few seconds in case someone is typing their question at the moment. Okay. Well, maybe you've answered all the questions. So, well, thank you. Do you have a last word that you want to share with
Yeah, I will
us?
say a few things. If you want to know more about sort of the little example I gave, I did a talk for it was a podcast at Swansea when I was there, called the Methods Cafe. If you just type in Swansea and Methods Cafe, it should come up. It's season 2, episode 2, where I go through that paradigm methodology method a little bit more concretely. It was for their master's program. There's also quite a bit of good research now. I mean, it's a growing body of research on particularly online harms, online researcher safety, trauma. If you are early on in doing this work, I strongly suggest you take a look at some of that. There's good work done on early career researchers by a few different authors who are also early career researchers. So you can sort of get a sense for like where that is for you in the field and ways of approach. If you are someone who is not embedded in a more traditional department like criminology, one of the traditional terrorism extremism departments, I strongly suggest like finding your way in connection to networks like this one, CREX to VoxPol. There are a few big networks where you can find community with people, because part of what you need to do this ethically and do it well and to be okay doing it, all of the empirical research shows is a community. That's part of what you need to do this. And so that is a thing to sort of prioritize for your success and your well-being, if you don't have it locally. So I would just, yeah, I've done quite a few networks now, and there's a bunch of good people floating around. You'll find your fit, but you will feel like a relief when you are talking to people and like they get what you're talking about for a change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Ashley, for your presentation, for your time, and for answering all of the questions. So that's all for us today. Do not miss the next webinar, which will be on February 19. So we will be hosting Stefan Bailey and Lewis Brace. They will discuss artificial intelligence and extremism. So do not miss this.
That's a
Thank
good
you.
report.
Yeah,
I
that's
know
a
that
good
report.
report.
It's a good one.
Yeah, it's also a Voxpol report, so you can also
Yeah,
have a look at it before the webinar to give you
flavor.
a better idea of what, yeah, an appetizer of their presentation. So do not miss this, and I'll see you all in a month then. Bye bye.
Thank you again.